Hello and welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm Hannah Mullaney, Client Solutions Director at Savile Assessment, and each episode I'll be joined by an industry expert to discuss the hottest topics in assessment today. Let's dive in. Hello. In today's episode, we're talking about managing talent in a digital age. I'm joined by Mike Rugg-Gunn, who's written an excellent and very interesting book on this topic. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Hannah. Hi.
Mike, you start the book by talking about the importance of the business context. How does the business context impact on talent management strategies and solutions?
Well, it's a very large topic, and it's impacted both by external factors and internal factors. If we look at external factors, the one that's most important at the moment is that of AI. There is no part of talent management that is not impacted by artificial intelligence. Recruitment, in particular, is impacted by machine learning. That's able to reduce the cost of hires and free up recruiters to indulge in more meaningful and strategic work than they've been able to do in the past. In selection, we also see volume assessment processes being automated, again reducing the cost of hire. In the area of retention, it is helping to predict attrition and also measure performance. And finally, in the areas of learning and development, it is able to personalize learning pathways based on machine learning that's able to estimate the impact of different learning content. So across all areas, AI is making a big difference. I think the critical thing here is to understand that just as we are concerned about AI nationally in terms of its ethics, that matters in talent management too. And I can give you one particular example whereby certainly in the area of facial recognition, for example, there's been recent research to show that African American and Asian faces have been misidentified 10 to 100 times more than Caucasian faces. And that research came out in airport surveillance, but it hasn't applied relevant to talent management too, which is why facial recognition has been dropped from video assessment interview processes by organizations such as HireVue. So there are dangers out there, and it does need to have some sort of constraints on it, not just in talent management, I would suggest, but nationally and globally too. So AI is the first thing, I think. Second area, I guess, is in terms of data. More data traverse the internet now every second than was stored 20 years ago. And if you speak to senior leaders and managers, they're saying it's like a fire hose coming at us. You know, we're being drowned and drenched in it. And there's a need really to understand how to make the very best use of data coming through, whether that's unstructured or structured data. And I think one solution to that actually is to have a data strategy. So that's about identifying, collecting, collating, and warehousing and democratizing data so that the people that need it have easy access to it when they need to make the right choices going forward. And that's, I think, a particular challenge for people at the moment. Yeah. I think the next area is probably in understanding the difference between digital transformation and digital disruption. People, I think, sometimes tend to confuse the two. Digital disruption, if we deal with that one first, is much rarer. And this is where a new entrant comes into the marketplace with an offer that creates so much value that the current existing businesses can't compete with that. It's usually a platform-based business that disrupts a product business. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Intercontinental Hotel Group, which own a Holiday Inn brand, and which started in 1954, have over 6,300 hotels and resorts globally. And they have a market capitalization of about $12 billion US. They've been disrupted, as most hotel groups have, by Airbnb.
Of course.
In 2008, which has no hotels, employs no hotel staff at all, and has a market capitalization of $100 billion US. In other words, 8 times that rather, of Intercontinental Hotel
That's
Group.
some disruption.
It is some disruption, and it shows the value of platforms over products very clearly. Digital transformation is much easier. That's where businesses are working on evolving business models that are new and different to provide and create value for customers, employees, and shareholders. So I maintain in the book that I think digital disruption is quite rare. You might see it in terms of Airbnb, ASOS, Uber, Netflix, but digital transformation is much more common. The pandemic had a transformative effect across both consumers and indeed the wider population. But I think in particular, behaviors that were predicted to change over 3 or 4 years actually changed over 3 or 4 months. And the most obvious one in terms of talent management was people working from home, which is now so-called hybrid working. I think the cat's out of the bag now. I don't think it's going to be in change anytime soon, but I think the honest assessment is there is a tension between leaders who want their workers back in the office and workers who have found newfound freedoms and really don't want to go back to the boring commute that was part of their time before.
5 days a week.
Absolutely. So I think this has had a significant effect too on people's working habits and has impacted talent management in many ways. And I think the other element that I discuss, I think, is the growth of the gig economy. This is freelancers. Some people predict that by 2040, 40 to 50% of employees will have worked on their own or be working on their own. So new organizations, large organizations, and I found it really quite difficult to recruit. These gig economy workers, freelancers, understand their value in the talent, particularly digital talent, and they want to work on their own because that gives them the flexibility to work with whom they want to, when they want to, where they want to. And that's a challenge, I think, particularly for HR business partners in understanding how to blend full-time employees with gig economy workers to provide a cost-effective solution to their talent needs.
And I guess that's where data's really important, right?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. And absolutely critical in gathering the right sort of data to understand what it is that is going to make the best choices going forward.
I think that idea of democratizing data is really, really interesting.
It is. And sharing it with everybody.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Giving everyone access
Indeed.
to the power that it may give.
Indeed. I think particularly, we just touched on it there, the importance of unstructured data. Structured data tends to be more quantitative, but what's really exciting today is unstructured data that's much more qualitative in nature. A lot of it coming from social media and how you glean and gather that and check it for reliability and validity to make sure it's fit for decision-making purposes. I think it's a really interesting challenge, but it does provide insights that are much richer in detail than you sometimes get from more established quantitative data sources.
Interesting.
Good. I think internally, talent management is impacted by strategy, and the rules of strategy have probably followed that from Michael Porter, who's been writing out business strategy for about 30 or 40 years. And some of his rules and models still hold sway, but some of them have changed because digital transformation and digital disruption have changed the rules of competition. For example, they've encouraged a two-way conversation now between the customer and the consumer. And it is possible now to personalize learning content for each consumer, and these weren't imaginable 20 or 30 years ago. I think that means that part of his theories are still relevant, but you have to adapt them, if you will, for the new world that's upon us right now. So that's certainly one area. I think the other one I'd certainly like to talk about is culture. Peter Drucker says that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think he's right. You can have the best strategy in the world going forward, but it means nothing actually if you don't have an enabling culture to action it in the business. And I talk quite a lot about culture in the book because I do see that as a vital component. I think the key element here in terms of talent management is how do you take your employees with you when you're seeking to change culture and get them to adopt new behaviors that are relevant for the digital age? And that's best done by keeping some areas of the old culture in place. So it almost acts like a cultural guide rail, if you will, for employees as they move towards a new culture. And that way they feel comfortable having the transition, and that means they won't be moving too quickly or feel alienated by what's in front of them.
So it's not a whole scale change, it's incremental sort of steps.
Yes. And I think that's really important, actually. You need to take the whole people with you all the time. And if you are scaling up at pace, as some digital businesses will, and you don't take everyone with you, or they feel culturally disabled, then I think you risk disaster, frankly, in your scaling up attempts.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think the next area, certainly internally, that I'd like to look at is that of business models. And a business model is really just the logic of how a business makes value. And in digital businesses, it's very different. And this is because the work of digital takes place in dynamic and fluid work environments. Things are changing very fast. And therefore, the winners are those who constantly review their business models for their relevance. And who, even when the business is doing well, are checking to ensure that it still has an applied relevance for it going forward. And also checking on the competition, seeing what they're doing in terms of their business models, and making sure that those are valid too. There's a really good website, actually, for anybody not sure about what a business model is, called businessmodelzoo.com. And I would encourage people to go to that to understand more about this. But that is the enabler of technology, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, within your book, you dive into a number of different areas in talent management. And so what I'd love to do with you today is dip into each one of those. I think it's safe to say that we're barely scratching the surface of what's actually in the book. So, of course, we'd recommend that everyone goes out and buys themselves a copy and reads it. But this hopefully gives people a little bit of a flavour for what's in there. So the first section that I think we'll talk about we'll dive into is recruitment. And the question that I want to ask here is, how do recruiters attract key digital talent to their business? Because that is a challenge that we hear about time and time again from clients. And we've probably been hearing it for a couple of years, and no one seems to have come up with the answer to that, I think. So what's your view?
Because the answer is multifaceted, I think, as you might have guessed. I think the first thing, blindingly obvious, pay a competitive wage. We know as psychologists that money is never a satisfier, but it is a dissatisfier. And people would be more likely to attend to headhunters' phone calls if they feel they're not being paid fairly, or the market rate has moved above what they're currently being remunerated for. So do get that bit right. And as a defense mechanism, that will tend to retain more people than you lose, if that's the case. I think do look at technology-specific communities. Slack, for example, is a business communication platform with both open and private channels of communication. And I think that would be one avenue to try, certainly having a look at communities like that. I think look internally as well. There's a really good example on the Savile Assessment website of work that you did.
Thank you for that plug.
Of work that you did with RICO of Europe, who are going to have a strategic review and about to lay off a number of people who are competent in role but not part of the strategy going forward. And from my understanding, you conducted an assessment of their suitability to undertake digital roles in the future. And a number of those went through that and were trained and developed. And you found, or RICO Europe found, 100 people for hard to fill roles. Now that for me is a cracking example actually of looking internally and using assessment and techniques for the benefit of people going forward.
It really is.
Also, I think those people will be really grateful. You know, they kept in role, kept to the same organization. They've learned and developed new skills. And from the business point of view, these are people now acculturated.
Yes.
And
So it links back to the culture piece.
It is. And you're de-risking their appointment as a result. They're much more likely to stay with you now because they've been treated very fairly and been given a good chance and developed in role as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's one area. I think that it pays to build relationships. It obviously does in any recruitment format, but it's critical with IT talent. It's no good going to the market once someone's resigned and speaking to a web developer and saying, come and join us, because they've already been tapped up by your competitors who've built relationships over a period of time. So relationship building should be a matter of course. You can't have transactional recruitment in that way. It just doesn't work anymore. And I think the final thing is to look at new sources of innovation. It takes one to know one. So referrals, I think, are one real avenue to look at. There is a business called Real Links, which does something called a referral jam. And this is where you get candidates together or rather you get employees together from your own business for a half-hour online jam where they produce referrals from their contacts. And there's a really good case study on the Real Links website of the work they did with Ocado, where they got 354 referrals within half an hour. So
that's pretty impressive.
It is. And it's that sort of use of technology actually for hard to fill roles that I think is quite innovative, quite different, and certainly people can consider as one way forward.
Definitely.
So I think in summary, keep it relational, not transactional. Do offer learning and development, particularly informal learning and development, learning in the flow of work rather than classroom orientated. Do offer meaningful work rather than repetitive work, and do offer work that is highly collaborative rather than stovepiped or working in hierarchical settings. Most digital talent these days expects to work in agile work environments. And if you're offering all that, I think you're going to stand the best chance of recruiting the best talent going forward.
Excellent summary. Thank you, Mike. Maybe let's dive specifically now into kind of selection, which is obviously part of recruitment, but it's much more specific. You argue in the book that for high stakes selection in digital businesses, we're actually not measuring the right things. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think that when we're doing high stakes selection, we're usually measuring something like the same competencies, that be commercial acumen, strategic thinking, communication, influencing, relationship building, team working, and all that sort of good stuff. And I think you should still need to measure some of those. But in the digital world, there are new behaviors you need to measure too. And I'll give you a practical example of what that's looked like. In the world of, or in the competency rather, of creativity and innovation, you would probably want to assess a senior leader for his or her ability to set out a culture of creative and innovative thinking, recognize and reward those who do it really well, generate bright ideas, and celebrate those when they are brought to market and they deliver a new product. That would be what you'd be expecting to measure. You'd also, in the digital sense though, be measuring their ability to conduct A/B testing on platforms. So trialing out these new ideas with the customers that gives you real-time feedback on their likely acceptance in the marketplace. And I'd be expecting to see a lot more of that sort of questions being asked. And with the viewpoint that actually that sort of testing would deliver minimum viable prototypes that again you can test in the marketplace and assess for their suitability. So it's that sort of indicators of a core behavior around creativity and innovation that we'll be assessing for at the moment.
So it's a different way of doing creativity.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's not throwing the old ways out. They still matter. Again, if you're assessing customer focus or you're assessing for a sales director, you'd still want somebody who goes out and meets customers, looks them in the eye, and has good, highly developed influencing, persuasive skills and can seal the deal. But they've also got to do other stuff. they again have got to use technology to understand customer motive and intent, and make sure that they're fully up to date with the real-time data that's coming through from that, and can adapt their sales techniques accordingly.
So it's that comfort with data and the ability to pick it up and use it to help them make decisions about where they should focus.
And to interrogate platforms to give you early warning of customer changes in behavior that I think keep you ahead of the competition. You're not waiting now for surveys or focus groups to tell you. You can action that stuff now, actually, and react to that quickly.
And so how might your assessment process change? Do we need to do things differently there?
I think we do. I think it'll change because some of the behaviors are going to change. I think, generally speaking, for digital roles work in quite fluid and dynamic work environments. There's probably more complexity now because things are changing so quickly. And that does put a premium on intellectual and aptitude skills. Actually,
we were talking about this earlier, weren't we?
Yeah, it does matter that people can be comfortable making sound judgments under conditions of uncertainty. And we're able to measure that psychometrically, as you know. And but I think that's much more to the fore now than it has been with analog businesses in the past.
Yes, definitely. Intellect, pretty key.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
So thinking now about employee retention. You're quite critical of annual appraisal systems. And I don't think you're alone there, actually. But what, in your view, should replace them? What else should be happening?
There is no more reviled a process in businesses than the annual appraisal review. Disliked intensely, I think, by both the appraiser and the appraisee.
Yes.
For its backward-facing nature and judgmental nature too, and the belief that nothing ever happens out of it. It just sits as a form somewhere in HR and gathers dust. That's the bad news. The good news is that I think digital technologies enable a new performance dawn to emerge that is future-focused rather than backward-focused, that is developmental rather than judgmental, that is data-driven rather than subjective, and that is evaluated within the context of team performance. This is really important. We're not just looking at individual contributions here. We're looking at how that individual works effectively within the context of project teams, particularly agile project teams, for example. And that means that feedback needs to change, and I think goal setting needs to change as well. And if we just talk about feedback first, I think it's an erroneous assumption to make that senior leaders all have both the willingness and the knowledge to give feedback effectively. Some of them don't. We know that. Okay.
Why do you think that is?
Well, some of them find difficulty with that. I think technical leaders in particular have a difficulty with that. But we know from research that recently conducted that showed that 3.8, believe it or not, feedback sessions a week over a 3-week period. If that was increased to 10, that significantly increased work performance because it strengthens the relationship between the line manager and the team member. And we know that correlates with improved performance. So there is now a really pressing need, I think, to ensure that all line managers, even if it's just one person, have good feedback training. They know how to do it. Hopefully they're motivated to do it effectively because that leads to better performance. And that means that actually there's no need really for an annual review because through a talent platform, feedback is happening regularly, certainly weekly. And I think allied to that is a need to be setting constant goals as well. We know from psychology that setting ambitious goals, which those are achievable, are a motivator and are certainly better than setting easy goals or no goals at all. The beauty of digital transformation is that actually you can alter the goals as you go along. In other words, you're not setting a goal in the annual review in January that you're then reviewing in December. I mean, that's pointless these days. the world is far too fractionalized and working too quickly
things
for that
change
to happen.
too fast.
It is, but talent platforms enable you to set goals much more regularly and to keep those flexible. And as and when they are accomplished or not, then new goals can be set. So you might actually have a series of 6 changing goals over a 12-month period. So a new performance management dawn on the horizon and not before time.
How ready do you think organisations are for that?
Well, it has to be done with a talent platform. I do believe that's the enabler of all of this. I think that I see some organizations doing it well. I see some not doing it at all. But to enable, if you really want to keep digital talent, you do have to keep people motivated. And most people leave, unfortunately, because they don't get on with their boss. So training the boss to feedback effectively and ensure good communication between him or her and the subordinate, I think, is absolutely key moving forward.
You talked there about you've seen some organisations do this really well, some not so. What are the differentiating factors there? What are the things that organisations who are doing this well doing that ones who aren't doing?
I think they've invested not just in talent platforms. I think they've also invested in the HR teams as well, giving them the skills to know how to adapt to digital work environments and making sure they're upskilled as HR business partners to make the very best use of the tools that are coming their way. And I think that's a key differentiator these days. Sometimes HR, I think, are often at the bottom of the list, both for IT investment in platforms, but also sometimes for training. And that needs to change. Definitely.
And I guess we're sort of segueing quite nicely into development territory here. You talk there about this being something that is developmental and not judgmental, the feedback process and that link to kind of constant appraisal rather than an annual appraisal. The question I want to ask here is, how effective is digital learning? You talked about our new world post-pandemic earlier, home working, hybrid working. I mean, we've certainly run more virtual training courses than face-to-face courses since the pandemic, and it's the new way of doing things. No longer do people fly colleagues across the world to meet in one place to run a training course. It tends to be digital. So how effective do you think digital learning is?
Just as effective as face-to-face is a very short answer. But you're quite right to say, actually, that online learning has increased dramatically. I think pre-pandemic, about a third of the training and development interventions would be online. During the pandemic, that rose every period of months to at least half. And it's carried on that way post-pandemic. And it's saving a lot of money as a result, just in the way you described. I think it's actually less about the modality of learning and more about a number of other factors that affect the quality of learning. For example, the quality of the instructor and how present he or she is during the learning intervention.
Do you think that the instructor needs different skills at all in a digital virtual setting compared to a face-to-face setting?
I do, yes. I think probably being more expressive in many ways, because one of the issues with digital that we find also in Zoom is it filters out nonverbal behaviors. It's much more difficult to read a person's body language through Zoom than it is if you're in a face-to-face environment. So yes, there is a big difference that way, one way or another. But I think other issues are around the quality of learner interaction. You can still interact really well, actually, with an online learning environment. You use chat boxes or you raise your hand to communicate. And I think support outside the classroom matters too. And you can do that both virtually and in person. A couple of other issues I think are unique to the online learning environment. Firstly, making sure that everybody's comfortable with the technologies. And that means having some sort of induction program beforehand to take people through it virtually so they know how to operate it and work it to the very best. that they can and make the best use of the learning and development that's available that way. I think learning overall is best done in the flow of work, just in time, just enough, and just for me.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. How do you, just maybe staying on that for a moment, how do you do that most effectively? If you think about what you've seen organizations do over the years,
Yeah. Okay.
what advice would you give people who are thinking about setting that sort of thing up?
I think one advice I give to learning and development professionals is don't be swayed by the bells and whistles of new technologies. The old theories about the principles of applied human learning and the transfer of training from the classroom to the workplace still matter. I know they were written 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, but they're still relevant now. And it is not a reason to discard those, to pursue more sort of trendy ways of learning, so to speak. That's not going to help transfer learning from the classroom to the workplace. And that's what we're after, because in that way, people are adopting new and different behaviors that achieve a commercial goal, which is my definition of learning.
Absolutely. And I guess linking to the post-pandemic world and the hybrid working, I think one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations that I have with clients in the learning and development space is particularly for more junior employees who maybe joined the organization either during the pandemic or post-pandemic. So this is for them not a new world, this is the world. But maybe what hasn't caught up is almost I hear it referred to as learning by osmosis, which in our old world would be sitting amongst your colleagues and overhearing conversations and listening to them on the phone. So much less structured in terms of learning, very much sort of on the job.
Yes.
But that we get so much less of now that we're all sitting on our own in our homes at our desks there. Have you got any thoughts on how to manage that type of learning?
Yeah. Well, learning the flow of work is clearly one. I think there's a greater understanding that people can learn through their mobile phones too, and they can be taking that learning with them anywhere they want to. So you can take it on the commute with you, if you will. You can access your phone and you can learn best that way. And using modern technologies for that, so that people learn wherever they happen to be, whenever they want to learn, I think is certainly a way forward.
That's a very good point. I did an online course on my phone on the way into the
Oh,
office
fantastic.
just this morning.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So, Mike, maybe we'll finish up by thinking about where do we go from here? And actually, maybe I'm a bit preemptive to say finishing up because I've got a few questions on this topic. First of all, what do you think are the implications of digital transformation on HR and talent teams? So what will they need to be doing differently?
Yeah, sure. A number of years ago, IPM came up with the notion of HR 3.0, and that contains 10 points. And if I just briefly run through those, I think in succession, I think that may be helpful. Firstly, that HR teams should be measuring employee performance continuously, just in the way I've described earlier in the questions. No use waiting for the annual appraisal. That now forms a key part of performance management. Secondly, I think investing in new leadership skills, just in the way I've described earlier. Leaders are going to have to adapt to changes in their work and technology and adopt new skill sets. And that includes HR business partners too, just in the way we've talked about a bit earlier. Next, I think have to feel comfortable designing and managing agile project teams and understanding how to do that really well, and to train people how to work effectively in teams. Sometimes I don't think team training gets the high profile it should do. You just put people into a team and you assume that they're going to collaborate, communicate effectively. Actually, they need to be taught how to do that. And team training is a vital component in that. Next, I think that they need to consider paying for performance rather than tenure. It's not how long you've been in the organization that determines your pay rise at the end of the year. It's how you're performing. And for that, some organizations, that's going to be quite a quantum shift in culture
Definitely.
going forward.
Yeah.
I think just we've described building skills in the flow of work, whether it's you learning on your mobile phone coming into work, but giving people that flexibility to self-develop themselves and giving them all the toolkit to be able to do that really effectively is important. I think modernizing using HR technology systems, investing in the best platforms to enable them to do the very best jobs they can. And I think critically applying data-driven insights. And this introduces us, Hannah, to the relatively emerging science of people analytics. It's actually now an MSc course in people analytics at the University of Hull. So,
interesting.
Yeah, that's why I guess it's an emerging science. But I think the data suggests actually this has not had the take-up amongst HR that you might expect.
Oh, and why do you think that is?
I think that because it is quantitative,
yes,
and very dry, and I'm sure that some people in HR would be put off by that.
Possibly find it a bit daunting.
I think so, and possibly not the reason they came into HR to attach numbers to people, and therefore put off by it. But it does enable them, if they're using it correctly, to ask different questions, I think, or enable senior leaders to ask different questions of HR teams. For example, as opposed to something like, what is the attrition rate in our business? You might be asking another question such as, what are the people factors that are impacting business performance? And that's a different, more strategic sort of question. That's data-driven by the sort of data that people analytics will generate.
Taking it one step further.
I think so, very much so, yeah.
How do you instill a desire in more HR folk to get into that stuff?
It's a difficult question, and I think that HR teams will have to incorporate more analysts into their process than has been the case in the past, actually. Specialist people who are comfortable in this arena to generate this data and make sure that it's valid and reliable for decision-making purposes, and feed it to the HR team and to senior leaders, because it is predictive, as we know, if it's used properly and effectively. Yes, indeed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think the evidence suggests actually that only about 10% of HR teams have achieved what we've just described, which is the basics of HR 3.0. But I think it's important they change, because there are some people out there who would seek to take away some traditional aspects of HR and put them under a different hat or different authority. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Some senior leaders view recruitment as so important now, because the talent equation is so vital, that they see that being taken out of HR and given to a senior director at board level. And that's because the skill sets required of recruiters and the behaviors required of recruiters are aggressive, invasive, highly focused, and highly energetic. And therefore they see HR as being everything that you do once someone has joined a company. That's a different skill set than that the recruiters need to adopt going forward. And they don't see those two skill set behaviors sitting equitably under the same roof.
Interesting.
Now, HR people watching this podcast will probably rail against that. But I just put it out there. I didn't make any comment on it. I put it out there as a thought that some senior leaders are taking that as a viewpoint going forward, as one way to progress, to make sure that the right talent is delivered to the business at the time that it's required to do so.
Really interesting. A whole nother podcast episode and discussion, I believe, we could have on that topic. You suggest in the book, Mike, that the digital revolution spells the end of jobs as a kind of structural unit of work. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, it's not my thought. It comes from two good sources actually. One is a book called The End of Jobs by a guy called Jeff Wald, and another is a researcher working for a Deloitte in New York called Sue Cantrell, and they write quite extensively on this. And it comes from the viewpoint that work is becoming much more fractionalized and much more project focused, and the key structural unit that determines membership of your project team is not going to be your job role anymore. It's the skills that you bring to the job. And therefore, the work of the future is seeing people with complementary skill sets who swarm around a particular project, complete that project, likely disband, and may reform again sometime later, perhaps for a different organization, to attack that project in the same way. So it's about the complementarity of the skills rather than the job title itself that determines membership of those project teams going forward. And that's part and parcel of on-demand talent, which is a result of why so many people are working in the gig economy these days and are predicted to continue to grow over the future. I think it's been caused by a number of other reasons as well. I think it's just a worldwide skills gap, particularly in digital talent. Even China, with 1.8 billion people, can't get enough digital talent in the business, and therefore, again, have to go to on-demand talent to do that. I think work is becoming more fractionalized, just in the way I've described. It's more broken up. It's more project-based. People are being paid per project now rather than per hour. And I think team-based work is much more to the form now than has ever been the case as well, particularly agile teams. And therefore, people need to have competencies in working in agile teams as well. And I think, generally speaking, in a more holistic sense, it's just a move away from traditional organizational structures. Very big organizations are struggling to get people to work for them these days. Young talent coming in prefer to work for nimbler, trendier, more agile organizations. Big organizations are struggling to compete for talent in that area.
Absolutely. And I think they're seeing that. And I've certainly heard a number of our kind of larger organization clients talk about the fact that they are pivoting to skills for the reasons that you've described there. I think for, a sort of these huge kind of multinationals, that is a task and a half. What do you think the main challenges are going to be for them, for those really big organizations that are trying to do this?
They have to make themselves a whole lot more attractive to younger talent coming in. And I think they have to start thinking about how they go on attracting digital talent to the business. There's a really good case study actually by Cisco UK, who went into schools with a Pathways project designed at 11 to 12-year-olds, just at a time when people are thinking about their careers. And they found two things from a Pathways project came out of it in particular. One was that this increased the ratio of BAME and female children interested in pursuing a STEM career. And secondly, that actually they got 70% people would consider a job with Cisco once they were leaving school as either an apprentice or a full-time role. So getting in early like that, organizations making a difference when people are thinking, going to schools and universities, putting themselves out there is one way around that. Secondly, they've got to wake up that people don't want to work for stovepiped, hierarchical, structured organizations anymore. It just doesn't, the world of work just isn't about that. And they need to change rapidly. Otherwise, they'll be disrupted.
Absolutely.
In the way we talked about beforehand.
And I guess the coming back to data and platforms that give you the information that you need so that you can pull together teams in the way that you need to and when you need to is really critical.
Absolutely.
And having good data as part of that.
Yes, and having a flexible, responsive work culture and environment where people are comfortable working in those sorts of areas and regard work as fun.
And finally, and I think this is something that we've sort of touched on at a couple of points in our conversation, but a really important thing to think about in this context. You discuss kind of issues of diversity and inclusion extensively across the book. What would you say are the key messages for the future here?
I think with the shortage of digital talent, or just talent as a whole in the Western world, it just makes real good commercial sense to cast the net as widely as possible. Why would you not want to do that? To give yourself the best chance of employing people who are going to help you achieve your business goals. So I think there's a commercial reason to do that. I think artificial intelligence actually helps diversity and inclusion because it eliminates bias in terms of both recruitment and selection when it's used appropriately and effectively. So that's a positive going forward. I think that moving on, there is some advice I would give around training and development around diversity, and that is not to mandate it. Don't make it a compliance objective. Don't design and develop specific courses around it. Rather, make it part of every learning and development intervention that happens in your business. In that way, it becomes culturally embedded. In that way, it's much more likely to find acceptance rather than being regarded as something that's a compliance objective going forward.
So you're not doing to people.
Yes.
And so then,
it just becomes part of the way we do work around here. And that we treat people fairly or equitably, and that everyone is treated as they would expect to be treated.
Yeah.
And then I think leads us probably to a slightly different definition of fairness than has traditionally been the case. There is some research out there that suggests people don't actually want to be treated the same. They want to be treated according to who they are as people, where they are in terms of their work life, their personal value set, and the quality of work that they do. I think that's one point. And I think people from ethnic minorities don't want to be picked because they come from ethnic minorities or because they're female or anything else. They want to be picked, frankly, because they want to do a really good job. And their diversity variable is not part of that consideration for them. So kind of a shift in opinion in those two areas, I sense, that I think are important for people to consider when designing diversity and interventions going forward.
So rather than, say, designing and running a women in leadership program, it's more about running a leadership program, but making sure that you have a properly representative demographic as part of your cohort.
Yes, I'm not averse to women being given supportive learning and development for them, particularly as they are in most countries of the world the main caregivers these days. That means that actually they've missed out on some development that men will have accessed. So in that sort of context, I'm comfortable that they have a rung. But I think on sort of training people on diversity and inclusion specifically, that is best done as part and parcel of every other training intervention you do.
I see.
Rather than a one-off.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Mike, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you
me too.
so
Thanks very
much for joining us.
You're more than welcome.
Take care.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of The Deep Dive. If you have, please remember to like and subscribe to stay tuned for all our latest content. If you want more information on any of the topics you've heard today, check out the show notes for case studies, resources, and articles. I've been Hannah Mullaney. See you next time on The Deep Dive.